Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Tomorrow, America chooses her president. But rather than another programme looking at the campaign, we're going to be talking about the sickness of modern democracy more generally, about the popular distaste for politicians in the States and here, about fanaticism and how to cure it, about the mutual misunderstanding, even the loathing of rival social and ethnic groups. And if you're already thinking, oh, thanks, BBC, that sounds cheery, let me add that I'm going to be having this conversation in front of a live audience at the Sage Gateshead as part of Radio 3's Free Thinking Festival, with three people who are famous as powerful advocates for change and have strong ideas. The great Israeli novelist Amos Oz, author of How to Cure a Fanatic, the former Irish president and human rights campaigner around the world, Mary Robinson, and the Canadian writer and sometimes politician, Michael Ignatieff. Michael, you've just been lecturing in the States about partisanship, which feels pretty topical just at the moment, and you make a crucial distinction between enemies and adversaries.
Yeah, Andrew, I think we forget that democracy is about the management of dissent. And in a democracy, I think we have no enemies. We have rivals, we have opponents, but we don't have enemies. Enemies are people you want to destroy. Enemies threaten you. Adversaries are simply people you compete with. And I think a lot in the American elections, sometimes I've had a strong feeling we've got a politics of enemies, a politics of mutual destruction. And that's just plain bad for democracy, and that's what I wanted to say.
Apart from being a writer, you led the Liberal Party in Canada. You got pretty hammered in an election at the end of that. But that experience leads you in your writing on politics to defend aspects of political partisanship and the importance of accentuating differences. In other words, you don't look at this from a sort of academic perspective.
No, not many people are dumb enough to be professors and politicians, and it didn't go so well for me. But I come out, believing passionately in politics and want anybody listening here to put their hat in the ring. And also, I'm a great believer in partisanship in the sense of a politician's job is to present the country with sharp and clear alternatives. Life is complicated. A politician is there to simplify, and a politician is there to lead a team. The problem, of course, is that that's partisanship, and some of the partisanship alienates the public, and they think these guys are not describing the world as I live it, and they're falsifying the issues. So, in a sense, politics is a constant battle between voters, them, and us, the political class, and that battle over whether politicians are really serving us are at the heart of democracy, but you can't do democracy without partisanship.
Mary Robinson, you were nodding vigorously there.
Yes, I think that's a very fair analysis. I also think that money has entered the politics in the United States in a way that really is very damaging because of a recent Supreme Court case that corporations, in a sense, have their freedom of expression as if they were individuals, and therefore they can pour money into politics, and we have these super PACs. I think that is very damaging. It's actually a form of corruption, and we have to recognise it as such.
Amos Oz, do you have the same scepticism in the Israeli electorate about partisanship and traditional party rivalries as we see in the States and the UK?
We have in Israel more political parties than individuals, almost. And we are a nation of 8 million citizens, 8 million prime ministers, 8 million prophets and messiahs, each and every one with his or her personal formula for instant redemption. Everyone shouts at the tops of their voices. No one ever listens except for me. I listen sometimes. That's how I make a living. But Israel is heavily involved politically. Every taxi driver will solve all the problems of the nation and the world for you in a 10 minutes lecture on a short drive.
Michael Ignatieff, one of the points that you make in your lectures, and you're going to be talking in Gateshead as well about this, is that the parties have to impose discipline. Parliamentary democracies work by being able to marshal the right number of MPs to vote in a particular way at a particular time. And yet, for the rest of us, people watching, the notion that anybody toes a party line, that their views are predictable and can be ticked off a list, is one of the things that makes us suspicious of politicians generally.
Yeah, I think something really bad has happened to parliamentary democracies all over the world, not just in my country, Canada. What's happened is increasing power to the Prime Minister, increasing power to the bureaucracy, and the legislature, Parliament, is a kind of empty, pointless debating chamber because it's all stitched up in advance by party leaders. Honesty requires me to say, I was a party leader once, and my instincts were always to shut those people down wherever I could. So I'm completely, flagrantly contradicting what my interests were not 2 years ago. But coming out of it, I do think we've got to have more free votes in Parliament. We've got to restrict issues of confidence. That is where the party has to vote, en masse, to budget and confidence measures, and that will make it much more difficult for prime ministers and party leaders, but it'll make it much better for you, the audience, because you'll be represented by MPs who can think and act on their conscience and on your interests. And until we break some of the power of parties in Parliament, I think Parliament's going to die.
Because, well, certainly, this country will be another by-election before too long in Rotherham, and I get the sense that what people want is to be represented by slightly unpredictable people who think for themselves and say slightly unexpected things, which is why people outside Parliament, Boris Johnson would be a good example, are quite popular.
Well, exactly, and no party leader worth his salt wants people who think for themselves. Thank you very much. And that's what I'm saying. There's a real conflict between your interests, I'm pointing out to the audience here, your interests as citizens and the interests of parties. Here there is a conflict, and I just think we do have to change the rules. We have to change the rules so that people can get up in Parliament and represent you, and it'll make life much tougher for the Prime Minister and for the Leader of the Opposition. Tough. That's how I conclude.
Mary Robinson, you were elected as Ireland's first woman president, but from the perspective of that job and again today, do you see the same kind of crisis of party loyalty in Ireland as we have, for instance, in the UK, and certainly happening in the States? More and more people feeling, no, I'm independent. I'm not going to vote down the line Labour or Sinn Féin or whatever it might be.
When I was elected, it was to the office of a non-executive presidency in Ireland, and that was a wonderful platform, if you like, in which to encourage a more pluralist Ireland, link with the Irish diaspora, help communities in Northern Ireland to come together in reconciliation. And I felt a freedom and a kind of moral voice on behalf of the people of Ireland to do that. And it's exactly the point that Michael's making. I was able to do that in a very linked way with Irish people. I wasn't bound, as I had been for the 9 years I was a member of the Irish Labour Party, having to vote sometimes for things I didn't actually believe in, but the party said. And to answer your question about Irish politics, I think there is actually a sense of a financial crisis that we're, in a resilient way, coming out of. There's going to be a constitutional convention and discussion, which I think will open up space for some reform in Ireland, which I hope will lead us in the right direction. I also belong to a group that Nelson Mandela brought together in 2007 called the Elders. I'm one of the younger elders, but I have to admit I'm still an elder. And we are actually thinking a lot about the divides in our world, in a more global sense, that within countries and between countries, there are really very big divides, and they're leading to a breakdown of trust of those who wield power and authority, a real breakdown of trust.
Mary, you lead us seamlessly and brilliantly on to that question of divided communities and divided political communities as well, because we see in the United States that Republicans and Democrats increasingly live in different parts of America, consume different media, and so on. When it comes to the job of bringing people together who haven't been speaking, haven't even been looking at each other, Ireland is one of the great examples of how that can be done, isn't it?
And it took a lot of outside help,
Yes.
you know, from the United States, George Mitchell and others, the European Union, for a population within Northern Ireland of 1.5 million at that time. And that actually was a humbling lesson as far as I was concerned, just how much concerted effort it took. And the key was when the two governments began to have an identity of purpose, to try to have a shared executive, shared power within Northern Ireland. And that was the last piece of the peace process, if you like, the willingness to share power. But, you know, I like the fact that the Irish peace process is looked to now by other places where there are still terrible divides and violence. But we had a terrible killing of a prison officer, David Black, the other day, shot in his car, going to his work. And I hope that there have been isolated cases. But I was in Belfast about 2 weeks ago, actually speaking on behalf of Irish Concern. And Belfast is such a cultural, vibrant city. And you know, it's wonderful to see the progress that has been made.
Almost up there with Gateshead, but not quite. Amos Oz, in your book about curing fanaticism, you have a very telling rebuke to the sort of sentimental view that if only we could get round the table together, people would understand each other. You say endlessly you're invited to have coffee with representatives of the Palestinians.
Many people, especially in Europe, tend to think that every conflict in the world is essentially no more than a misunderstanding. A little group therapy, a touch of family counseling, and everybody will love everyone else. Time and again, I'm getting those rosy invitations to spend a wonderful weekend with Palestinian counterparts, where we drink coffee together and chat with each other and discover that no one has a horn and no one has tails, and we get to love one another and the trouble will go away. I keep telling those people that essentially there is no misunderstanding between Palestinian and Israeli. The Palestinians claim the land they call Palestine, and rightly so. We Israeli claim the same land, and we are also right. It's a tragic clash between right and right. Rivers of coffee drunk together cannot extinguish the tragedy of two peoples rightly claiming the same land. What we need is a livable compromise. Coffee will come later, preferably Arab coffee.
And Mary, when you go around the world with the elders, how important is it to make sure that people are clear about the nature of the conflict and don't believe that simply they can hold hands and look each other in the eye and everything's going to be all right?
No, I just agree so much with what has just been said. And I've just come from Jerusalem, Ramallah, and then Cairo, and talking with Egyptians. This is a very difficult time. They're in the process of a new constitution, and the divides are very real. And the fundamentalist tendency is really worrying women, particularly. And women are being harassed in the street. And, you know, it's interesting. I've been going to Egypt, you know, from time to time over the last, 20 years. And you very rarely see a young woman now without head cover. 20 years ago, and you know, and part of that I think is an identity. It's actually a positive thing, but it's also potentially harassment if your head is uncovered. And so it's a very difficult time. Women were so visible during the Arab Spring, and I think the Arab Spring itself, in human rights terms, is very interesting. I'd love to hear Michael's view maybe on this, because it was social media that gave people the courage to come out, because they wouldn't be the one or the two against very dictatorial regimes where you were imprisoned and disappeared if you did that. And they came out in their tens and then their hundreds and their thousands into the streets and squares. And what they wanted was human dignity and jobs and ending dictatorial regimes. Now what they have is a kind of mix of more fundamentalist, better organized Salafist and Muslim Brotherhood, and the secular components feel very they're not together, they're not well organised, and they haven't done this before, and suddenly they see the gains disappearing.
Well, we're coming on to the whole area of human rights. I think we should fess up at this point that Mary Robinson and Michael Ignatieff are both formidable campaigners and writers on the subject of human rights, but don't take necessarily exactly the same view. Michael, you take what I suppose Mary would describe as a more narrow view of human rights. Just explain that to us and why that's important to you.
Oh, God, the idea of having a quarrel with Mary about human rights, nothing seems like a worse idea than that, because I have enormous respect for Mary's contribution. I just think that you got to be very careful about distinguishing between rights and aspirations. There are a lot of things that absolutely must happen in the world that Mary and I passionately agree about. Everybody's got to get food, everybody's got to get water, and everybody's got to get shelter, and 900 million human beings don't have all three of them. And then the question becomes whether you should call those things rights. And obviously, in some sense, they are rights. The problem is, how do you cash those rights out? I don't think you can have rights unless you have a rights bearer and a duty holder, and you can hold the duty bearer to account. And my problem with calling this stuff rights is that it may make it more difficult to get justice for people. It's not a disagreement whether these things are essential, but I hope you feel my pain here. This is one of the great women in human rights advocacy, and I'm arguing with her. I mean, I haven't got a chance of winning this argument. You understand?
I'd certainly dismiss you from my Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights for what you just said.
She just fired me.
Because, happily, most governments of the world accept that economic, social and cultural rights are rights. And they're rights that governments must progressively implement without discrimination, and they must make budgetary measures. And you can start to hold them to account. You don't go into court to enforce economic and social rights, except sometimes. There have been some cases, but that's not the main way of doing it.
Amos Oz, in your essays, you make a very eloquent plea for politicians to understand that we are now in a world where there are serious scarcities.
Yes, well, to come back for a moment to the issue of human rights, I read somewhere recently that close to 2 billion human beings never sat on a toilet seat because they don't have one, because they cannot afford one. Maybe this is where human rights begin, afford a toilet seat for every human being on this planet. Now, the 20th century was an ideological century, heavily ideological century. And it followed centuries of certainty where every human being knew three things: where he is going to live, which is close to where he was born; what he or she are going to do, which is close to what their parents did; and what is going to happen to him or to her in the afterlife. Those certainties collapsed. Then came the ideologies. When the ideologies collapsed, came the age of gadgets, the age of self-centered selfishness. We cannot afford this anymore. We cannot afford this anymore. Poverty, fanaticism, despair, hopelessness are threatening from all directions. And the fanatic, as I say in my essay, is a walking exclamation mark.
Michael Ignatieff, I'm bringing this back to the American contest that ends tomorrow. One of the big problems is that we don't know what democracy would look and feel like in a world where politicians told the truth about the end of the gadget obsessed, selfish half-century. We're actually going out to people and saying, do you know what? You're going to have to make do with less for the sake of the next generation and for the sake of people around you. When politicians like yourself try to talk about climate change and carbon taxes and all the rest of it, you get whacked.
Yeah, you do get whacked, and I've got the scars to prove it. The voters' capacity for bold truth is strictly limited because all of our capacities for bold truth is strictly limited. It was tough to face reality. And a lot of politics, modern politics, is about facing realities. That is, we haven't got all the resources we want. We're going to have to cut here or cut there or reduce there. A politics of scarcity is a very tough politics, and a lot of voters out there are shooting the messenger, one after the other. Tell me a happy story here, because I don't want to hear the bad story. But we've got to face up to the bad story. And also, the other thing I would say is we have to acknowledge just how important politicians, that hated breed, actually are. You're not going to get peace in the Middle East unless, not through having coffee, but by elected politicians or some kind of politician doing a deal that nobody likes very much, but it's better than no deal at all. And a lot in an age of scarcity, a lot of the deals that we're going to have to live with are going to be deals that a lot of the audience isn't going to like very much. But the only thing I'd say finally is that everybody talks about how locked up or messed up American politics is. Never count that place out would be my first thing. And the second thing I'd say, somebody said something very interesting to me. It was Martin Wolf of the Financial Times, just to quote an authority. He said 2008 was an election you'd want to lose because the economy is going to be terrible for the next 4 years. 2012 is actually an election you want to win. And that's one of the things that's at stake here. So scarcity, yes, but there may be opportunities here that we can't foresee.
Well, some of them just come from the mid-Atlantic, because Hurricane Sandy arrives. This is a campaign where nobody has talked about climate change or global warming at all. And then the mayor of New York, who's a Republican, Bloomberg, actually endorses Obama as a result of it. Mary.
What I feel is that we haven't got serious enough about the climate issue because it's not yet enough about people. Now, that superstorm Sandy made it about people in the United States, not for the first time, because they've had several recently, but they're beginning to appreciate it. But I think when we recognise that that climate is undermining poor livelihoods in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America, in small islands, that we have to get urgent about it. And I have a hope, actually, that it's going to change the perception of what politics is about to a common purpose of addressing the fact that if we don't change course, we're going to have far more severe weather shocks everywhere. Displacement of people, they say maybe 200 million may be displaced by climate-displaced people, climate refugees by 2050. That's not so far away now.
No.
And so I think, let me put it in Irish terms, and I'm overstating in a way, but I feel this. When I was running for president in 1990, what impressed me greatly was a spirit of community self-development all over the country. And we had an Irish word for it, the spirit of mehel. Mehel is like Ubuntu in Africa. It's I am because you are, the link with the other, because of the agricultural, doing one field 1 week with the one tractor and then moving to the next farmer's field. If that farmer was sick, you still did the field. Then we had the Celtic tiger. Selfish, gadget time, everybody showing off their latest gadgets. And now we have a coming together in an economic crisis where the neighbourliness is coming out, where in towns and in parishes in Ireland you can see people are helping each other again. So there is that sense. If we can understand that climate change is actually a common threat to all, and it's already deeply affecting the poorest, because that's one area where this country has been very good on its aid budget and has held to that budget despite cutbacks. And I must say I greatly credit the government at the moment. I don't credit them for everything, but credit them for actually holding on to that. I think if we can see that there are places where people are not climate resilient. They don't have insurance, they don't have a plan B. New York, for all that's happening, is climate resilient because they have FEMA, they have the mayor of New York, they have government support and insurance.
And Michael Ignatieff, that is where any optimism must come from. It's back to the old Winston Churchill thing about democracy being a terrible system, just better than all the other ones. Yeah. In the end, under pressure, maximum pressure from external forces, people will do the right thing.
Well, I think that, one thing I teach my students is they come to me all the time saying that politics doesn't matter and our politics is terrible. I say go to a place where politics is really terrible. There are all kinds of places in the world that have literally been destroyed by bad politics, by the inability of political leaders to do what they have to do. Iraq right at the moment is completely stuck with bad politics. I could go around the board with places where your life chances, literally your chances as a young person, are ruined because you've got such terrible political leadership. Greece would be an example of a place that over 30 years politicians destroyed their country. Now, when you put that helps to put, the problems in Britain or the United States or in my country in context here. Good politics, that is ordinary, decent, semi-non-corrupt politics that sort of gets it done, is a blessing. And
a noble calling, despite what people think.
And a noble calling, despite what people think.
Amos, since we're now onto the area of the conversation which is about cures and about answers, one of the things that you say in your essays is that humour and imagination are utterly key to bringing people together, or at least bridging some of the gaps between antagonistic, fanatical societies.
Humor, imagination, and I will add curiosity, are powerful antidotes to fanaticism. I have never seen a fanatic with a sense of humor, nor have I ever seen a person with a sense of humor turning a fanatic unless he or she lost their sense of humor, which might happen. So if I could only compress sense of humor, imagination, and curiosity into capsules and persuade entire populations to swallow my humor capsules, I would qualify for a Nobel Prize in medicine, not in literature.
You tell a very good story, because humour can be quite hard-edged and aggressive. A fellow novelist in Israel, with one of your 8 million prime ministers driving the taxi and having a real go at him about wanting to kill as many Palestinian Arabs as possible.
Yes, the driver said to my fellow novelist that we ought to kill all the Arabs. My fellow writer took a different strategy. He said, whom do you think should kill all the Arabs? The driver says, we must kill them. Well, we have to do that. No, be more specific, please. Who has to kill them? Doctors with injections, or maybe the army, or maybe the police, or maybe the fire brigade? Silence. The driver is thinking. Then the driver says, every one of us has to kill a few. And my fellow novelist says, all right, suppose you are allocated one block of flats in Haifa, which is a mixed city, Jewish-Arab mixed city. And you knock on every door and you ask the people, excuse me, do you happen to be Arabs? And if they say yes, you shoot them dead, you finish your block, you go home. On your way back, you hear a little baby screaming at the 4th floor. Will you go back, climb the 4 steps upstairs and kill the little baby as well? Silence. The driver is thinking. Then the driver says to my fellow author, you know, sir, you are a very cruel man.
And that is obviously a story about a dark humour, but also a failure of imagination, because again and again you return to the subject of imagination. Literature, you argue, can be another antidote.
Yes, I believe a person who imagines the other is a better person than a person who doesn't imagine the other. A curious person is a better person than a person who is not curious. I even believe that a curious person is a better lover than a person who is not curious, but this is too early in the day to discuss this aspect of curiosity. So, yes, I believe reading literature sometimes may help in immune people to fanaticism, because it's a product of curiosity. It makes you ask yourself, what if I were him? What if I were her? My own sensitivity to the plight of the Palestinians, my own empathy to the Palestinian people, originates not from a special expertise in Arab history, not from intensive acquaintance with many Palestinians. It originates from my own inclination since a very young age to ask myself, what if I were him? What if I were her? How would I feel? This doesn't make me pro-Palestinian. I'm not pro-Palestinian. I think it's a tragic clash between right and right, as I said earlier.
And sorry, Amos, we should say that you started off as a child yourself as a fanatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was born as a little fanatic. The first English words I ever learned to pronounce, save for yes and no, were the words "British go home," which is what we Jewish kids in Jerusalem used to shout as we were throwing stones at the British patrols in Jerusalem. So I was a slogan-screaming little Zionist fanatic. And what cured me was an encounter, a chance encounter, with a Hebrew-speaking British police sergeant. And his Hebrew was biblical and very frail, and he and I agreed that I teach him some Hebrew and he teaches me some English. That made the enemy personal for me. I could no longer hate impersonally all the others. I had to imagine the other. I had to put myself in the shoes of others and under the skins of others.
Michael, this suggests that if we're going to have a healthier politics, it cannot simply be done by politicians. You've been very eloquent in your defence of the things that politicians have to do, but there has to be an open, liberal, cultural conversation going on around and through politics. It has to be a conversation involving writers and audiences, which allows a sense of imagination. Perhaps in the context of Britain and America, the imagination to understand what it's like to be living below the breadline, the imagination to understand what it's like to be a member of a kind of small migrant community pressed in from all sides.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has to worry you about our societies is income inequality, rising income inequality, and increasing polarization. We don't talk. I agree entirely with Amos that the world's problems will not be solved by more coffee, but talking, being forced to listen to what you don't want to hear, is the condition of a healthy democracy. And as our media fragments and polarizes, people only listen to what they want to hear. And we're in these kind of echo chambers which reinforce what we already believe. And income polarization is literally meaning that lots and lots of the Americans that I have the honor to teach at Harvard never encounter anybody for whom America is unfair, unjust, cruel, and difficult. You can't run a democracy unless you have that. The other thing you absolutely have to have, and given that the BBC is having a tough time at the moment, it's worth saying, you absolutely bloody have to have a public broadcaster where everybody listens to the same thing.
In your earlier career, Mary, you also showed how important law is. We've talked about politics, we've talked about culture, but when it came to early campaigns that you ran, for instance, on the rights of travellers, something you mentioned in your memoir, and gay rights and so on, quite often these things cannot be started for one reason or another in a parliament, in an elected assembly. They start in a courthouse.
Certainly at that time in Ireland in the late 70s, 80s, it was very important to be able to advance the agenda by taking cases. The most fascinating one I took was for a woman called Josie Airy. It was a poor woman in Cork. And she wanted to get separated from her husband, whom she claimed was beating her up. And he had been convicted of assaulting her in the district court and fined I think less than £1. And she wanted a judicial separation, would have to go into the High Court. She wrote to the Commission on Human Rights in Strasbourg a long letter with a lot of irrelevance, but with a key point that she couldn't get a solicitor to take her case because she couldn't afford it. And if she won, her husband wouldn't be able to afford to pay the costs. And so the Commission understood that the Irish government had something to answer for. And they said, well, she can go in herself and be a lay litigant. And it was clear nobody had been able to do that because the High Court was complicated. And it ended up that this woman, by pursuing her case, which I enjoyed arguing before the Commission and then successfully before the Court of Human Rights, changed access to civil legal aid, not just in Ireland, but also in other European countries. So by having a Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and a Court of the European Union in Luxembourg, it's possible to take cases on equal pay, on social welfare. It's not a substitute for good democracy. I mean, I agree with all the points that Michael's made. This should be central to good government, but it is an alternative route, and I think will always remain one, where, and in particular on issues like gay rights. Again, I took a case for David Norris to the court in Strasbourg because we failed in the Supreme Court in Ireland, and that resulted in a change in the law, which now everybody is very happy about in Ireland. The trouble with David Norris was that he kept becoming more successful in Ireland. He got elected to the Irish Senate. He was a lecturer in Trinity. I kept saying to him, I'm trying to argue that you're discriminated against, and you keep being successful. But luckily the court decided in his favour.
There is, and we've heard it today as well, a general assumption that in a system like the European system, human rights are better protected than another system. But I'd like to finish actually by having a little bit of a whack back at any European smugness, because, Amos, one of the arguments that you've made is that Europe is far too ready to take sides in a sort of censorious, high-minded way about what's going on in your part of the world.
Yes, I'm amazed of the fact that Europeans who often despise Hollywood and Western movies, when it comes to international conflicts, they tend to always ask who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, launch a demonstration in favor of the good guys, sign a petition against the bad guys, and go to sleep feeling good about themselves. To some extent, this is understandable. The 20th century was a century of black and white conflicts. Fascism and anti-fascism was black and white. Colonialism and decolonization was black and white. Vietnam, in my view, was black and white. Apartheid was black and white. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not. There are no good guys and bad guys. It's a clash sometimes between wrong and wrong, not always between right and right. But I wish the Europeans will take a more complex attitude, rather than waggle the finger at this party or at that party and tell us Israelis or us Palestinians that we ought to be ashamed of ourselves. The real question ought to be, how can we help? And in fact, both Israelis and Palestinians could use every ounce of empathy they can get from Europe, because they are facing, the Israelis and the Palestinians are facing a painful surgery, an amputation for both. The partition of the land and the creation of two states, Israel next door to Palestine, is going to feel like an amputation both for the Israelis and for the Palestinians. This is time for empathy. You no longer have to ask yourselves, am I pro-Palestine, am I pro-Israel? You have to be pro-peace.
Mary Robbins. Mary, you got quite a hostile reception after the Durban discussions on racism from Israel, didn't you?
Yes, and I was there very recently in East Jerusalem and with Jimmy Carter and Gro Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway. We've been there a number of times over a period of 6 months gap, and each time we go, the situation in East Jerusalem is dramatically worsening for the Palestinians. They're being put out of their homes. There are settlers coming into what were Palestinian areas. And you have a sense that the so-called facts on the ground are being changed in order not to have the two-state solution. And we actually put out a statement and we said that under the current Israeli government, and we very much accept your point, it's important to distinguish the Israeli people and a current government. And under the current government, there seems to be a policy of not wanting a two-state solution for the first time. And that's really worrying. And we therefore believe that supporting the Palestinian request, which will come later this month, I understand, to the General Assembly for non-member status, is a move for the respect and dignity, even of non-member statehood, at a time when the facts on the ground are going so badly against the Palestinians having a state which includes the 67 borders with some adjustments and that part of East Jerusalem.
I won't object. and acceptance of Palestine by the United Nations as a full member of the United Nations. I think the Palestinians deserve their statehood. I think the attitude of the present Israeli government is wrong and dangerous, but also the attitudes of the Palestinian fanatics, the Palestinian extremists. In fact, the clash is no longer between Palestinian and Israeli. It's a clash between fanatics and extremists on both sides and pragmatics on both sides. This is the real clash in the Middle East.
I agree.
And we come back to where we started, Michael, the importance of politics, not just the rest of us understanding the compromises that politicians have to make, but accepting that compromise is not a dirty word, it's a good word and an essential word.
Yeah, and there's a wonderful Israeli philosopher, Avishai Margalit, who distinguishes between honorable compromises and rotten compromises. You should neither Israel or Palestine should accept rotten compromises. But what I think is so disappointing is over 30, 40 years, political leaders had a chance, it seems to me, at various times to seize an honorable compromise, a compromise that, as Amos says, does involve the amputation for both sides, giving up on certain dreams, giving up on certain hopes in the interests of a peace that both can live with for a long time. And the political failure to seize the honorable compromise is both disappointing, but it's also extremely dangerous. People seem to assume the status quo can go on forever. It doesn't seem to me it can, and we owe it to the kids on both sides to give them something better than what they've got.
You know, Michael, there are good news and bad news. We all know the bad news from the Middle East. The good news is that the majority of the Palestinians and the majority of the Israelis are unhappily ready for a compromise, for a two-state solution. If I could use a metaphor, I would say the patient is unhappily ready for the surgery, the doctors are cowards.
Thank you to all my guests and thank you to my audience. Mary Robinson's Everybody Matters, a memoir, and Amos Oz's essays, How to Cure a Fanatic, are both out now. You can hear Michael Ignatieff talk about enemies in politics tonight on Radio 3, and Amos is talking on Radio 3 next Monday. There are links to all the free thinking events on the Start of the Week website. Here, next week, we're going to be recreating real life when we pit biography against documentary with the award-winning director Kevin MacDonald, Roger Grafe and Jenny Uglow. But for now, thank you and goodbye from the sage Gateshead.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. Tomorrow, America chooses her president. But rather than another programme looking at the campaign, we're going to be talking about the sickness of modern democracy more generally, about the popular distaste for politicians in the States and here, about fanaticism and how to cure it, about the mutual misunderstanding, even the loathing of rival social and ethnic groups. And if you're already thinking, oh, thanks, BBC, that sounds cheery, let me add that I'm going to be having this conversation in front of a live audience at the Sage Gateshead as part of Radio 3's Free Thinking Festival, with three people who are famous as powerful advocates for change and have strong ideas. The great Israeli novelist Amos Oz, author of How to Cure a Fanatic, the former Irish president and human rights campaigner around the world, Mary Robinson.
Citizenship alienates the public, and they think these guys are not describing the world as I live it, and they're falsifying the issues. So, in a sense, politics is a constant battle between voters, them, and us, the political class, and that battle over whether politicians are really serving us are at the heart of democracy. But you can't do democracy without partisanship.
Mary Robinson, you were nodding vigorously there.
Yes, I think that's a very fair analysis. I also think that money has entered the politics in the United States in a way that really is very damaging because of a recent Supreme Court case that corporations, in a sense, have their freedom of expression as if they were individuals, and therefore they can pour money into politics, and we have these super PACs. I think that that is very damaging. It's actually a form of corruption, and we have to recognize it as such.
Amos, do you have the same scepticism in the Israeli electorate about partisanship and traditional party rivalries as we see in the States and the UK?
We have in Israel more political parties than individuals, almost. And we are a nation of 8 million citizens, 8 million prime ministers, 8 million prophets and messiahs, each and every one with his or her personal formula for instant redemption. Everyone shouts at the tops of their voices. No one ever listens except for me. I listen sometimes. That's how I make a living. But Israel is heavily involved politically. Every taxi driver will solve all the problems of the nation and the world for you in a 10 minutes lecture on a short drive.
Michael Ignatieff, one of the points that you make in your lectures, and you're going to be talking in Gateshead as well about this, is that the parties and the Canadian writer and sometimes politician Michael Ignatieff. Michael, you've just been lecturing in the States about partisanship, which feels pretty topical just at the moment, and you make a crucial distinction between enemies and adversaries.
Yeah, Andrew, I think we forget that democracy is about the management of dissent. And in a democracy, I think we have no enemies. We have rivals, we have opponents, but we don't have enemies. Enemies are people you want to destroy. Enemies threaten you. Adversaries are simply people you compete with. And I think a lot in the American elections, sometimes I've had a strong feeling we've got a politics of enemies, a politics of mutual destruction. And that's just plain bad for democracy, and that's what I wanted to say.
Apart from being a writer, you led the Liberal Party in Canada. You got pretty hammered in an election at the end of that. But that experience leads you in your writing on politics to defend aspects of political partisanship and the importance of accentuating differences. In other words, you don't look at this from a sort of academic perspective.
No, not many people are dumb enough to be professors and politicians, and it didn't go so well for me. But I come out, believing passionately in politics and want anybody listening here to put their hat in the ring, and also I'm a great believer in partisanship in the sense of a politician's job is to present the country with sharp and clear alternatives. Life is complicated. A politician is there to simplify, and a politician is there to lead a team. The problem, of course, is that that's partisanship, and some of the